After the recent meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Alaska, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is on his way to Washington. While the talks were closely watched, no agreements were reached. To help us understand the implication for Ukraine, we are joined by George Kent, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, former Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, and former U.S. Ambassador to Estonia. Thanks for joining us, Mr.
Доброго
Kent.
дня. Доброго дня.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Headlines around the world have described the Alaska summit as Putin's triumph and the end of Vladimir Putin's diplomatic isolation. How do you assess this meeting, and did it really go 10 out of 10 as Donald Trump himself described it?
Well, I saw a number of commentators saying that it was a Nichivo burger. I don't think there were actually any substantive results from the meeting. The biggest result was the breaking out of Putin from diplomatic isolation and his ability to see the pictures of him coming down on a red carpet treatment on U.S. soil in Alaska, I think was the most significant accomplishment by Putin. He didn't bring anything, he didn't give anything, and that is classic Russian negotiation. So I don't think there were concrete results. I think we have a process now in play, and the critical actors that were not in Alaska are Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and European leaders.
On the eve of the summit, reports suggested the meeting could last 6 or 7 hours with a planned lunch and wider team discussions, and all of which were cancelled at the last minute, and even the one-on-one format was changed to 3-on-3. And from your diplomatic experience, what does this last-minute changes signal? And do you think it was better that Trump wasn't alone with Putin?
For people who are looking on the one hand, on the other hand, you look at the positive side for Putin, the arrival. The negative side, if you will, from the Russian perspective, was what happened for the rest of the sessions. Indeed, the scheduled lunch for the larger delegation was canceled. That suggests that there was nothing further to discuss about expanding U.S.-Russian relations, which reports earlier said might happen. Also, the fact that it wasn't a long one-on-one meeting, as in Helsinki, shows that Trump's team understood the dangers of having an extended one-on-one meeting between Putin and Trump. And so if you looked at also the body language afterwards, the American officials were not looking particularly happy. And you don't need to rely on me. This is how Fox News was covering it live in the room. So I think there were other reasons to say that both Putin's team in particular and maybe Trump's team came in with expectations for more to be accomplished. And in fact, there was less than met the eye.
Do you really think that Putin had some expectations? Because as we know, his conditions to end the war in Ukraine, they're similar as they were in 2024 and even 2022, if we are talking about the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And now Putin keeps saying that we basically need to change the way Ukraine wants to develop. For example, I'm talking about NATO membership, I'm talking about its European path, and etc.
I don't think Putin's war aims have changed one bit. Putin is not interested in a peace agreement with Ukraine. He's interested in the destruction of the Ukrainian state and incorporating parts of Ukraine into Greater Russia. This has always been his plan, and the so-called peace process or diplomatic negotiating processes are just a way to get to his end. And he has shown time and time again, going back to the Minsk agreements in February of 2015, he'll put anything on a piece of paper and then violate it. He had German Chancellor Merkel and French President Hollande in Minsk. They signed an agreement, and a week later he took Debaltseve, violating the terms of the ceasefire agreement. So frankly, I don't see any agreement that Russia signs as being worth the piece of paper it's signed on. And this has been the Russian way of negotiating about Ukraine since 1654 in the Treaty of Pereyaslav. Bogdan Khmelnytsky didn't think he was signing away Ukrainian independence. That's what happened. It also happened at Yalta when Churchill and Roosevelt thought they were carving out avenues for partial independence in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union and Stalin just steamrolled and ensured there was a unified Eastern Bloc. So this is the Russian way of negotiation since 1654.
Now in the media there is much speculations about Trump and Putin's agreement. Reports suggest Putin favors a comprehensive deal while Trump prefers a quick peace. What do you see as the most likely outcome of this meeting?
The most likely outcome is the fighting will continue. And I think this has been the reality since February 2015 in the Minsk agreements, since 2014 when the war started. This is not a 3-year process. This is an 11-year process. And the war has always been a possibility of ending on Russia's terms. And if anyone is foolish enough to accept Russia's terms, that could be the end of the war. But accepting Russia's terms is accepting full-scale occupation and the type of devastating conditions that have occurred both in Crimea and occupied Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. And that's not peace, that's occupation. And I think the reality is people will meet as they have since 2015, but that will not end the war. And the war will be decided on the battlefield between Ukrainian and Russian armies. And to the extent that the West should be supporting Ukraine more firmly, we need to put maximum pressure on Russia. That means seizure of the frozen assets, 300 billion, and giving those to Ukraine to help rebuild the country in the war effort. It means high sanctions on the shadow oil fleet and secondary sanctions on those who continue to profit through trade with Russia, fueling its war machine.
Senator Lindsey Graham has claimed the war could be over by Christmas if Zelensky, Trump, and Putin meet. Do you believe in this scenario, and do you believe that Putin would actually meet the Ukrainian president, given that he considers him illegitimate?
Well, he met once before in Paris in December of 2019. That was another nothing burger. Nothing happened after Paris. The fighting continued. And Putin went to Minsk in February 2015 and met Poroshenko, Merkel, and Hollande. And they reached an agreement. And as I said, 4 or 5 days later, the Russian army kept on going and seized Debaltseve. So I don't think that a meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin is going to solve and end the war any more than Hollande, Merkel, Poroshenko, and Putin ended the war in February of 2015. It is an opportunity for the sides to put forward their demands, but Putin is not going to agree to sensible terms that Zelensky and the Ukrainian people want. And I don't think Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are going to accept terms of occupation and dismantlement, which is Putin's terms.
If we are talking about this bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin and recent develops, do you see any risks that Ukraine could be sidelined in the future US-Russia negotiations?
If you look at the composition of the American officials who went to Alaska, many of them did not have any particular role in the Russia-Ukraine war. They potentially could have had a conversation, wider conversation about the American-Russian relationship. That part of the meeting, the expanded lunch, did not happen. So I think there's always the potential for a wider conversation. But I think if you look at the body language and what happened in the shortening of the overall meeting, that did not occur in Alaska, and it's to be determined whether that wider conversation happens in the future.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is heading to Washington this Monday following his conversation with Donald Trump. What topics do you expect them to discuss, and do you think there is a risk of repeating the Oval Office scenario where the Ukrainian leader could be pressured to accept a proposal from Trump and Putin, for example?
I think it's very important that President Zelenskyy and President Trump meet face-to-face and have the conversation. I think there is a tendency for President Trump to repeat and say things that he hears from the last interlocutors that he meets with. So if you go back several days ago, he had a conversation with European leaders led by German Chancellor Merz and President Zelenskyy, and he talked about the desire to have a ceasefire. Then he went to Alaska and met Putin, and he dropped the immediate ceasefire and focused on the extended peace. So I think meetings, conversations between Trump and Zelenskyy are very important, and we'll see how far that conversation goes, but it will not resolve the fundamental issues. And the fundamental issue here is not what Ukraine has to do to stop the Russian army advance. It's what Russia will do to stop its murderous war of invasion and occupation. And ultimately, that is up to the Western countries to take firmer action against Russia and to give more support to Ukraine. And I will say the majority of American people very much support giving more assistance to Ukraine. This is not a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats both support giving more assistance to Ukraine. I'm cycling across the United States right now, fundraising for Ukrainian frontline units, and the Americans I speak with, regardless of their political affiliation, support Ukraine and want to see Ukraine succeed. So you've got the high-level politics between leaders, and then you have the senses and views of simple Americans, and Americans support Ukraine.
But do you think Trump in the future will support Ukraine as well? I mean, I'm talking about military assistance.
I think at this point, the U.S. position under President Trump and the current administration is allowing sales of U.S. arms to Ukraine, primarily European countries buying U.S. arms. It does appear for now that the large-scale assistance, military assistance, that occurred during the Biden administration is not going forward. But as President Trump mentioned in his interviews with Fox News yesterday, it was under his first term that the U.S. initially provided javelins to Ukraine. So there is a track record in the past, and President Trump, even in his tariff policy, has a track record now of making threats, making offers, pulling them, and changing tactically what the final position is. So again, I think the meeting between President Zelenskyy and Trump at the White House is critically important for the U.S.-Ukraine relationship going forward.
You served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs during Trump's first term. And from your perspective, how seriously does the White House and Trump in particular take the historical lectures that Putin likes to give, especially about connections of Russia and Ukraine, Kievan Rus, and etc.?
Well, I think President Trump is president then, president now. His team is very different. And if you looked at the officials who were in the first Trump administration, many of them had deep experience in national security, and some of them also had experience dealing with Russia and even the Soviet Union. The current team in the second Trump administration does not have that bench of expertise and knowledge of either Russia and Ukraine. So it really doesn't come down to the team as much as it does President Trump himself. And Putin can give his lectures and pull out maps and give his fake version of history, Ukraine's history and Russia's history. Honestly, I don't think that matters to President Trump and to his team. That is more a part of the Russian information effort for Russians and people in the West to confuse them and divide them. And that has been the Russian approach under the active measures doctrine of the Cheka all the way now through the FSB to divide the West, use disinformation as a weapon, and seek to weaken the solidarity of what they see as their opponents. And that includes Ukraine, it includes Western Europe, and it includes the United States.
Donald Trump announced that he will not impose new package of sanctions on Russia at least now. And how could you explain this delay on new sanctions against Russia? Because as we know, it was first of all ultimatum for 50 days, then for 10 days, and now we also don't see new sanctions. How could it be explained?
I think if you look back since January and the use of threats and then the actual imposition of sanctions, the positions that President Trump says publicly change sometimes on a daily basis. And so you have the strange situation now that while he has not imposed additional sanctions on Russia, he has imposed additional sanctions on India for buying Russian oil. He did not impose those sanctions similarly on China, which also buys Russian oil. So I had mentioned before that there is become this pattern of the threat of imposition of sanctions and then backing away at the last moment. And I would anticipate that pattern well established now, not just related to Ukraine and Russia, but to countries all around the world, will likely continue.
And my last question about security guarantees, because just recent news says that President of France, Emmanuel Macron, said that coalition of willing will continue working on the security guarantees for Ukraine. What kind of scenario do you see in terms of security guarantees, and especially from the US side?
I think the details on this are absolutely critical. Much conversation over the last 30 years has been made about the Budapest Agreement. And in the Budapest 1994 agreement, in the end, the US insisted that the word be used as assurances, not agreement. And that lack of security guarantees, as opposed to assurances, has created a lot of confusion over the last 30 years. So the ultimate guarantee is a willingness to send your own troops to defend a friend or an ally. That's the essence of the NATO Article 5 guarantee. It doesn't have to be within a NATO context, but that willingness to fight for friends and allies is ultimately what every country is looking for, and why so many countries have joined NATO over the last 30 years, to include most recently Finland and Sweden. Sweden was neutral for 200 years. It has now joined NATO because it wanted that guarantee of countries coming to its defense if Russia attacks.
Mr. Khan, thank you for this conversation and for your insights.
Thank you, Sofia.
Thank you for joining us today. That's it for now. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. For the latest updates, follow our X account, War and Politics 24. The link is in the video description.